that my students are reading, are going to read, that they're going to encounter all over, whether that's in school, in our classes, in the news that they take in, and in culture and society at large. And I want to share with you today um, a brief example, actually, of a lesson that I ran earlier this year that came from several years of approaching the area within my field of teaching Latin of learning English derivatives that come from Latin. And I want to share it with you whether you are a teacher of Latin or a teacher of really any subject, because one thing we all have in common, whatever it is that we teach, we're going to teach with words. Um, if we're talking about English, we're going to have a common set of words that we know and that we've seen. And I think what we see, where we see them, maybe where we come from, but really more than anything else, what comes to mind when students encounter them um, is something we can say we all have in common. So I'm going to share with you that bit, and then we'll talk about afterwards, really briefly, some ways that you might apply this, not only to these handful of words that I'm going to share with you, but really as an approach for how you might look at words that show up in your own discipline that, to go back to the title of our session, may be embedded in something that really may speak towards an instinct, um, or a movement towards social justice that you may be feeling and that your students may be feeling. I'm going to share something on my screen. I have this queued up here. We'll go to the desktop. Uh, Not that, of course, although we might come back. Click on here. Here we go. And I want to share with you a passage, and I'll make that fill the screen. Normally, of course, if I were in a class with you, I would either pause and have someone else read it. Um, Probably just as often I'd read it. And so I'm going to read it to you. But actually, I would encourage you to pause the video as it is right now and just read it to yourself. And I'll say before I read it to give yourself a chance to take in what you see, to make observations. That might be writing notes. Many of us, if we're teachers, it's an instinct. Maybe we have a pen or pencil at the ready, or maybe we're just ready to be typing at any moment, or maybe we're just noting something that we're thinking. I often tell my students before we make any observations whether we're looking at a passage or a work of art, there's no right or wrong when we're making observations. We're just sharing what we see. Um, all right, I'm going to read to you the passage. Virginia McCaskey, the Bears' 97-year-old matriarch, won't let the coronavirus stop her from watching games in person. She will travel to attend the season opener Sunday in Detroit, Bears chairman George McCaskey said Thursday. Uh, Came from a piece in the Chicago Sun-Times in September, and the title was Virginia McCaskey will travel to Detroit for Bears opener, Patrick Finley. As I read, um, you maybe noticed things. Things may have jumped out at you, or maybe they just sat there alongside other things. What you probably noticed, because I underlined it and because the word is at the top left, is the word matriarch. This came from a lesson where it's actually the opening chapter of my Latin textbook. They're learning words from families. Pater and mater, of course, are some of the first words. My book happens to introduce the pater first and then the mater. When I teach my students, probably for a number of reasons, but I tend to focus first on words that come from mater. Um, so if you've taken a moment to maybe notice what you notice about the word matriarch, now you might imagine for a moment, what might students notice about the word matriarch? In fact, I'm going to go a little bit further and say, What might your own students, whether you teach math, science, English, or Latin, imagine a room full of students that you know that are your students. How would they react? What might they share of their own observations about the word matriarch? Is it something about Virginia McCaskey? Is it something about her age? She's 97 years old. Maybe it's something about how she won't let the coronavirus stop her. Maybe they're noting, maybe they've heard the word before, and they're picking up on something they may not know is Greek based, but arc is a tack on to the Latin part. Mater, arc, comes from a Greek based word that basically means a ruler. And whether they're knowing it or not, maybe they know from a cultural background or having read the word and seen it without knowing what it means, or maybe they do, that this is a mother leader of sorts. And in some way, this passage kind of gives us this sense that Virginia McCaskey is a mother figure, perhaps, to the Bears and a leader figure. All right, that's one passage I want to show you. And I will say that to me, when we learn words, we always start with reading. And I think that's a big piece. Starting with reading is a chance to say, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to tell you the word means this. I'm going to show you. That instinct we all know from teaching writing, show, don't tell, is a more effective way to engage your reader. It's certainly a more effective way to engage students when they're learning. We all learn words because we see them somewhere. And so when I teach language, when I teach words, especially English words that come from Latin, I want to start with a passage. And here's a passage. I'm going to read it. I'll this time read the word aloud. It's quite similar to the first word, matriarch. This is the word matriarchy. And the passage says, when the show first aired in late 2007, the world was introduced to a family of 6 women and 2 men, headed up by self-styled momager. And if you have a student reading that aloud in class, she may struggle for a moment with that word. It's a made-up word for the moment. Momager, Kris Jenner. The family is a matriarchy, and many critics dislike this intensely. And this also came from September. Keeping up with the Kardashians, no more. The complicated legacy of reality's first family, from a writer named Meredith Jones on a website called news24.com. If you've talked about the word matriarch and what your students noticed, it's not too far a jump for them to possibly figure out what matriarchy is. Depending on the age of your students, depending on the demographic, depending on their own cultural background or interests or anything else, they may know the name Kris Jenner quite well. They may not. They may know the show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. They may not. In my own classroom, it sparked enough recognition that that was a good amount of context, along with the word matriarch we had discussed a few moments before, to be making sense of what a matriarchy is. A family run by a mater figure. We already know the sense from the passage before that arch is a Greek-based word that means leader. And this is a family that has leadership in the form of a mother, Kris Jenner. Whether they know the Kardashians or whether they don't, they can get a sense from this passage about the structure of matriarchy. Okay, we have 2 words now from mater, and we built upon that. And I want to share with you one more word, also comes from mater. And this word, when we take a look at it, it's matrimony. If you're an educator and you're reading it, perhaps your mind went into a different direction. The arc is gone, the leadership part, and now you have a word that comes from mater. And you may know already that this word really does take our conversation in a different direction. Miss Allison Ann Menard and Mr. Freddie Leonardo Rodriguez, both of Houston, Texas, were united in holy matrimony on Saturday, August 1st, 2020. The couple exchanged vows during an intimate ceremony at the Westin Houston Medical Center. Leon Heidechoke officiated the 5:30 p.m. nuptials. Um, Menard Rodriguez joined in holy matrimony from the AcadiaParishToday.com website, September 7th, 2020. Um, it's a wedding announcement, and it's something worth sitting with for a moment that we've really transitioned, right? We've been talking about matriarch and matriarchy, and matrimony took us in a bit of a different direction. Um, Depending on the classroom, you may be thinking it yourself, but I would say if you're introducing words like this, um, you may have the instinct to do a lot of telling. And I really wish that we were all in reality here together. But since I'm here with this screen in my pretend background of books, I'll do a bit of the leading that just say that if I were in a classroom filled with students, they may notice things are a bit different here than in the first couple of passages. They may notice right away that it is about a wedding. Depending on the age of the student, the younger the student, in my group where I introduced this fall, were seventh grade students. Um, Seventh grade, I think, like any moment of cultural awareness, is about a half and half. They're at that age where some of the room will be well aware of something, and the other part really may not be. The best thing to know about teaching a middle school class, especially seventh and eighth grade, is that you're never really going to know who's going to be familiar with any aspect of culture or society that you come in to the room with, to reference or something else. Well, in any setting of students, most likely because the passage makes it clear this is a wedding announcement and marriage is a big part of this. So we've gone from female leadership, matriarch of the family, the mother figure of the bears, to a structure of matriarchy for a family where the Kardashians are a matriarchy led by a female figure, to matrimony, a mother based word about marriage. And I remember, and this is what struck me as maybe someone who's been teaching for 50 years, maybe someone who's been around. I was in seventh grade 30 years before them, which means my own sense of marriage is probably quite different, even though I've grown up into this world of ours, um, within what I'll say freely is probably my own pretty progressive outlook. And yet my conception of marriage was such, or at least societal awareness, that I was surprised almost when a student said in one of my sections, I have three different sections of seventh grade, and we had this lesson with all of them. Wait a second. And this was a question that a student asked: what does being a mother have to do with marriage? And the best thing about a student observation, and of course, questions can be observations, and that very much was, it, ma- it made no sense that there's a natural connection for this student between being a mother and the structure of marriage. And it was a really robust and fascinating and important conversation that went from there. And I did my best, tried my best to not lead the discussion somewhere. And if I did, it was perhaps somewhere along the lines of, I wonder if this word comes from a history, because we all have a shared history, even if it's not the same shared history, but we can all recognize that there is a history that says that marriage and motherhood are connected. And perhaps that connection isn't quite as obvious to a student in the seventh grade today. It's probably worth noting this is an all girls school where I teach. And it was not a question to the room filled with classmates. And when I say room, of course, I do mean Zoom classroom. These are all pulled from September 2020. It didn't shock anyone that she would ask that question. No one had the response. And if you know a middle school classroom, you know that if someone says something that's different from the norm, you're going to get a response. And there was not a single response of, What do you mean motherhood and marriage don't connect? And again, what struck me and what I tried to do my best at in this conversation was not to take the conversation anywhere, to let the passage be the passage, to let the observations come from students genuinely without any concept that there's a right or a wrong, and let the conversations go where they go. Um, and it was something I didn't anticipate, even that what do you mean there's a connection when I shared these three words? Well, we've looked at three words that come from mater. Let's take a moment now and look at three words that come from pater. And I think you'll see the pattern play out pretty readily. The first word we're going to look at in a passage is patriarch. And you may tell from the passage that the shows I'm familiar with may not be the ones that my seventh grade students are familiar with. If I'm familiar with Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and also, as you'll see in this passage, Modern Family and its patriarch, Jay Pritchett, it tells you a little bit about the generation, and I will say the TV watching of perhaps my own generation. Here's the passage. Not to diminish the significance of this aspect of Modern Family's depiction of fatherhood, but the series actually attends little to Cam and Mitchell as fathers. Rather, most stories exploring contemporary fatherhood do so through the eyes of family patriarch Jay Pritchett and his son in law, Phil Dunphy. Modern Families, Modern Fathers. The decade's best sitcom is also its most important. And actually, this is not from September 2020, but actually June 2014. So if you are familiar at all with the show, and this is an article from Salon, this goes back quite a few, 6 years already. In, of course, for any of us living through this pandemic, what feels like a different world. And I always think that any discussion of social justice in society really needs to take in a stamp of date of when a passage is written. And of course, this may say something for those of us who are older and may have a sense of how 2014 is different. In my own classroom of seventh grade students, none of that really stood out too much. Some of them maybe didn't even know the show, but many did, actually. And Patriarch, they knew. We actually spent one class just focusing on the words that come from mater, and then maybe did a bit of Latin for reading, and that was class. And this was the next class, which for us was a few days later, all three sections, by the way. And we referenced back, um, I will say naturally, or maybe I made reference to it. We looked at all the mater words, let's look at the pater words. I don't know that I hit it over the head at first that this is analogous to that. In other words, if there's a matriarch, there's a patriarch. And I think that that's a valuable thing to do. And what I mean is to not necessarily say outright, now we're going to look at a word that's analogous, and maybe they don't know what the word analogous means, to the word we saw last time. We can strip out all the intro and the prep and let the passage be the passage and read. Depending on the section, I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes I will read the passage myself, and sometimes reading the room, I can see that there's a student that wants to read the passage, or that the room will benefit from a student reading the passage. You as the teacher, it's always great to read the room and make that choice. What's going to play out better for students if I read it or if they read it? Um, how can I get out of the way as much as I can so that they can encounter the passage? And sometimes that actually means reading, and sometimes it's them reading. Well, we read through this passage, and sure enough, in all three sections, without my making the connection and hitting it over the head, they saw right away there's a pater and there's a leadership. And Jay Pritchett was the leader, the father leader in this family. Perhaps it's not surprising. It seemed that while there was recognition on the part of students for this passage, by and large, the conversation didn't break into one about the show. I kind of thought it would. I also know that my pop cultural references the longer I teach, the less likely I am to find something that they know. Um, that just is what it is. If you're on the younger end of teaching, you may know more of what they watch. I know for me, I thought I did know the same things they do, and I learned that I don't. Um, but just the same, the passage has obvious resonance that is a patriarch figure. We looked at a TV show with a matriarch previously, and now we're seeing a TV show with a patriarch. Okay, analogous. Whether we've said it's analogous or shown by reading, we've got a word that looks like the other word. There's a mother figure, there's a father figure, they're both leaders. Now let's dig in a bit more. We looked at matriarchy, now let's look at patriarchy. Blazing a path through the post war patriarchy, Ginsburg enrolled first at Harvard Law, where women were denied entrance to one of the libraries, and where she was once asked by a dean, "Why are you at Harvard Law School, taking the place of a man?" She became the first female member of the Harvard Law Review, but ultimately finished her legal studies at Columbia following a move to New York with her husband and young daughter Jane. Although she ranked at the top of her class, Ginsburg was denied a clerkship at the Supreme Court from Justice Felix Frankfurter, who inquired whether Ginsburg wore a skirt, adding, "I can't stand girls in pants." Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice and pioneer of gender equality, dead at 87. Tim Dickinson and Tessa Stewart, Rolling Stone, September 18, 2020. Um, I should mention that it was my lesson plan already to make this set of comparisons between words that come from mater and words that come from pater. And it just so happened that the news that we all learned in the middle of September about Justice Ginsburg's passing happened right around the time I was preparing this lesson. And so I happened to find a passage with the word patriarchy that focuses on this really consequential announcement, as we all know. In a seventh grade classroom, once again, half the room is going to be filled with students who know about the news and are aware of it. In my own all girls school where I teach, they're all pretty aware. I think whether from conversations in school, maybe at a town hall meeting, or maybe in a history class. But I think our curriculum and our school community is such that students were pretty well aware. At the same time, that doesn't mean that every seventh grade student is taking that in quite the same way. And it was about half and half who were sort of connected to this piece of news, and half that weren't. I say across the grade, three sections, probably about 50 students in total, maybe 45 to 50. This, of course, in any setting, depending on how old your students are, can absolutely lead to more of a conversation about a matriarchy versus a patriarchy. Um, and of course, there can be full sessions well beyond the purview of this one about the patriarchy that might exist, that I say might, that does exist within our own society, and how we've been grappling with it for decades and much longer as a society, most recently, and over recent history and in the history before then. Um, what this sort of linguistic lesson allows students of any age to take in is a straightforward word for word. In other words, we're learning Latin. We're learning about a Roman family, which, by the way, of course, as you would imagine, itself is filled with cultural topics. A familia in ancient Rome didn't just include a mother and a father and children, it included a household. And that meant people who were enslaved in the household. There is so much culture to be gleaned from such a setting of just listing of family members. And this particular lesson, which I want to share with you well outside the boundaries of a Latin class, is such that you can take a few simple words, or maybe more complex words, but words that are relevant within your class that can be lined up one to the other or taken on their own, but presented to students in passages. And I will say, the prep I do for this sort of lesson, um, most of these, as you saw, came from September 2020 when I was prepping it. I've been teaching Mater and Pater, of course, for a decade and a half. Um, Depending on the lesson, depending on the year, depending on the moment, um, I feel the need to say, let me find a new passage. Let me find a passage that maybe captures an essence. Again, as I mentioned, I didn't set out to find a passage about Ruth Bader Ginsburg when I was originally prepping this lesson. Uh, the the history and the moment coincided where I was looking for a passage about patriarchy, and this news had happened. Um, Giving students a passage, particularly one that's recent or near recent, a few years old, but something that speaks to a reality of their own, is a really fantastic way to open up a conversation. And to me, I think, as I think you're seeing already, and you're probably doing in your own classrooms, to not be prescriptive about this, but let the passages speak for themselves, let the observations flow without a right or wrong, and let the dynamics of the words, because one thing that we can get to in this conversation is that the word mater and pater have been there forever, longer than the Romans, actually. They're not necessarily specifically Latin words. Um, they're broadly Indo-European and really cross cultures. Um, and look where they've taken us. And it's a way to unpack a topic within something of a presentation that's really already there when you found a passage to connect. I want to show you one more word, and if you're doing the math at home, you can actually see where this is going. Um, we had a bit of a curveball from matriarch and matriarchy to matrimony. We looked at analogous words like patriarch and patriarchy. Well, by analogy, if there is matrimony, there is patrimony. But this is a word, I will say, of all the words, this is actually the word that my seventh grade students probably knew the least. And if I had to guess across society, it's probably the word that people would know the least. Patrimony is a funny word, and it actually has nothing to do with marriage, except insofar as perhaps it is possible that if you have a father who has left you something, then perhaps, depending on your own family, that father might have been married to a mother. Although, of course, these are all structures that are constantly changing and evolving. And like my seventh grade student noted, um, this does not have to be connected to marriage per se. Well, patrimony, let me read the passage. Ahmad al-Faqih al-Mahdi was party to the destruction of shrines in his homeland of Mali, shrine which have been recognized over the centuries as an important locus of prayer and pilgrimage, and as testimonies to a once great civilization. This week, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the first time the prestigious court had so explicitly recognized the destruction of religious and cultural patrimony as a war crime. And this came from an article in The Economist. It was September, but 2016. The slow acceptance that destroying cultural heritage is a war crime. Patrimony actually means something that is passed down from another generation. It gets its idea from a pater giving something. It's very gendered. Um, a classroom full of seventh grade students in an all-girls schools may wonder, why is it that it's just a father that may pass something down as an inheritance? And that's certainly a modern classroom's kind of question. That was one, actually, I will say, that I had anticipated them asking and they didn't. But that doesn't mean that next year's class or a class like it won't ask such a question. I think it's a really likely question. But when I ask them all together, all right, we've now learned 6 words in the last 2 classes, 3 that came from mater, 3 that came from pater. Maybe matriarch and patriarch are pretty similar. And matriarchy and patriarchy, while pretty similar, may have different cultural connotations. And depending where the conversation went in your classroom, a matriarchal society and a patriarchal one living within a patriarchy may bring a very different conversation. Um, these curveballs at the end of these two sets, I asked them in a question that they would go off on their own and do a bit of writing. Essentially, why do you think the word matrimony evolved the way it did? Because words evolve. Why did it take on its meaning? And patrimony took on the word that it did. Now, the meaning that it did. It, to me, is a really valuable way to enter a conversation that can really lead towards etymology bringing up a conversation about social justice. Um, for one, we can't really understand what's going on in the now unless we understand how we got there. And of course, as an educator, you're probably pretty on board with that. To know what came before is to have a better sense of the now. And matrimony and patrimony are two wildly different things. And they say quite a lot about the society that gave us both of these words. Um, One of the things, and I guess this is where I'll close this short lesson, is to say that every section went different places with that, both individually in terms of how the students responded to that, um, and I think as a group in terms of the conversations when we had them. But I think the overarching theme is how striking it is that when we look at words, and I only chose three. I actually originally, when I was prepping this lesson, had about a dozen words that come from mater, words that come from pater. Many of them might be familiar already, like maternal or paternal, or maternity, paternity. Um, but the more you dig into words that are quite common, mother and father, and what they give us in the more challenging words, the more you see in quite a striking way. And I don't think that I really thought in quite this way, though I knew all the words, just how much it tells you, um, where people are in a society based on the language that we use. Um, this is a short lesson that can be done, all told, about 10-15 minutes of both of those classes. And then we went on and did our Latin. Actually, I will say there is one section of the three that really stretched this into 25-30 minutes. And this could, of course, be a 40-minute or longer lesson, depending on the classroom, depending on what you want to do with these. There's so much to unpack. And so I would encourage you, whatever your class, whatever your subject, take a word that, whether it's a Latin based or anything, take a word that exists, line it up against something similar, or simply look for words that are related to that. You may really be surprised at how much there is to unpack about what it tells us about the society that gave that. To be quite honest, when I first thought about this, I'd been teaching Latin for years, but it wasn't until this fall. And maybe it's the moment that we're in that led me to this. But I've been a sort of progressive thinking Latin teacher person, I should say, not just Latin teacher, all this time. And it never occurred to me how much can be unpacked from the words mother and father in the very first chapter of my teaching them a language. I'll stop sharing this screen, and I want to say thank you for sticking with me if you've made it this far into the video. And I would love to be able to chat with you at some point. I'm sure my contact information will be made available. Thank you for learning with me. Bye-bye.